You are crouched at the edge of a firelit camp, roughly 30,000 years ago, and something is watching you from the tree line. Not a threat. Not quite a friend either. A wolf, thinner than the ones deep in the forest, sitting just close enough to catch the smell of roasting meat, and just far enough to bolt if you throw a spear. You don't call it over. You don't feed it on purpose. But you don't kill it either, because it isn't attacking anyone, and honestly it hasn't in weeks. It just sits there, at the edge of the light, night after night, and slowly, without anyone deciding it should happen, something starts to change. And here's the thing that should stop you cold. You did not tame that wolf. Nobody in that camp captured a wolf pup, raised it by hand, and bred it on purpose to make a friendlier animal. That's the story most people carry around, the one where some ancient genius looked at the most dangerous predator in the forest and thought, I bet I can turn this into a pet. Almost every serious researcher who studies this now says that story is basically backwards. Humans didn't domesticate the wolf. The wolf, in a sense, domesticated itself, and humans simply failed to stop it from happening. So here's the question, the one this entire video is built around. If nobody deliberately captured wild wolves and bred them into something safer, if there was no farm, no breeding program, no moment where a human decided today I make a dog, then how did one of the most dangerous animals on the planet turn into the animal sleeping at the foot of your bed? What actually happened, mechanically, biologically, across those thousands of years, and why does the evidence suggest it happened by accident, driven by garbage? And the answer is not simply wolves got friendlier because humans were nice to them. That's the version that fits in a caption under a cute picture. The real answer involves a trash pile, a stress hormone, a set of foxes in a Soviet laboratory that accidentally proved the entire theory decades later, and a genetic side effect nobody predicted, one that gave us floppy ears and wagging tails as a kind of biological accident, a leftover of selecting for something completely different. Because here's the thing nobody tells you, the traits you love most about dogs, the friendliness, the floppy ears, the tail that wags instead of holds still, none of those were selected for directly. They came along for the ride, attached to something else entirely. Let's start with the trash pile, because that's genuinely where this story appears to begin. Somewhere between 15 and 40,000 years ago, human hunter-gatherer camps started generating something that had never existed before in quite this form: a reliable, concentrated pile of leftover food. Bones with scraps of meat still on them. Discarded organs. Spoiled portions nobody wanted to eat. Every permanent or semi-permanent camp accumulated a garbage dump, essentially, and for any wild animal capable of tolerating the presence of humans, that dump represented an enormous, low-effort calorie source. No stalking required. No risk of being gored by a fleeing elk. Just walk close enough, eat what's been thrown away, and leave before anyone gets annoyed. Wolves, being opportunistic and highly social already, were perfectly positioned to exploit this. But here's the catch: not every wolf could actually do it. Approaching a human camp is terrifying if your brain is wired for a wolf's normal, intense flight response, the same hair-trigger fear reaction that keeps wild wolves alive by making them bolt at the first sign of danger. A wolf with a hair-trigger stress response couldn't tolerate being that close to torches, voices, and moving bipedal predators long enough to actually eat the scraps. Only the wolves sitting at the calmer end of the personality spectrum, the ones whose stress hormones didn't spike as violently at the sight of a human, could actually hang around the edge of camp long enough to benefit from the free calories. And that's the entire mechanism, right there, in a single sentence. Calmer wolves ate more reliably, survived better, and had more surviving pups, who inherited that same calmer temperament. Nobody needed to select for it on purpose. The trash pile did the selecting automatically, generation after generation, favoring whichever wolves could tolerate proximity to humans without falling apart internally. This is what researchers call self-domestication, and it's a strange, almost uncomfortable idea once you sit with it. The wolves that became dogs weren't chosen by us. They chose themselves, by being just calm enough to eat our garbage without dying of stress. It's worth sitting with how brutal this filter actually was in practice. A wild wolf's stress response exists for good reason. It keeps the animal alive around genuine predators and genuine threats, humans very much included for most of the Ice Age, since humans hunted wolves, competed with them for the same prey, and would have killed one on sight in plenty of circumstances. So the wolves willing to tolerate proximity to a species that might kill them weren't just calmer by a little. They were operating with a fundamentally different risk calculation, one where the calorie-reward of camp scraps outweighed a fear response that, in every other context, was there to keep them alive. Over enough generations, in enough camps, spread across enough of Ice Age Eurasia, that specific, narrow subset of the wolf population kept reproducing more successfully than their more anxious, more aggressive relatives, who either kept their distance and missed the free calories, or got too close and ended up killed for it. Now here's the part of the story that turns this from a reasonable guess into something closer to a proven mechanism, and it comes from a Soviet laboratory experiment that had nothing to do with wolves at all. Starting in 1959, a Russian geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev began an experiment on silver foxes, animals bred for fur farming, that were otherwise essentially wild in temperament, aggressive, fearful, and difficult to handle. Belyev's method was ruthlessly simple. In each generation, he selected only the calmest foxes, the ones that showed the least fear and aggression toward humans, and bred only those individuals forward. He wasn't selecting for floppy ears. He wasn't selecting for cute markings. He was selecting for exactly one trait: tolerance of humans, measured as calm behavior instead of fear or aggression. Nothing else. And within a shockingly small number of generations, something extraordinary happened, something nobody had explicitly asked for. The tame foxes didn't just become friendlier. Their ears started flopping instead of standing upright. Their tails started curling and wagging instead of holding straight. Their fur developed patches of white, piebald coloring that wild foxes almost never have. Their skulls became slightly shorter and more juvenile looking. Their bodies started producing lower levels of stress hormones across the board. None of these traits were selected for directly. Every one of them showed up as an accidental side effect of selecting purely for calm behavior around humans, and this pattern has a name now: domestication syndrome, a whole bundle of unrelated-looking physical traits that keeps showing up together, across completely different species, whenever a population is bred for tameness alone. The leading explanation researchers have proposed for why all these unrelated traits keep bundling together involves a group of cells in a developing embryo called neurocrest cells. These cells migrate around the body early in development and end up contributing to an oddly specific mix of tissues: parts of the adrenal gland, which controls stress hormone production, parts of the skull and cartilage, pigment cells that determine fur coloring, and parts of the ear structure. Because a single population of embryonic cells feeds into all of these seemingly unrelated systems at once, selecting hard for one trait linked to that population, calmer adrenal glands and lower stress hormones, appears to drag the other traits along with it as an unintended package deal. Floppy ears and patchy fur aren't separate decisions. They may simply be downstream consequences of slightly underdeveloped neurocrest cell migration, riding along on the same genetic lever as reduced fear and aggression. Which means the floppy ears on your dog, the curled, wagging tail, the patches of white fur on a face that would otherwise be uniformly wolf-gray, none of that was the point. It was the fallout. A side effect of selecting for calm nervous systems, tangled up somehow, at a genetic level scientists are still working out, with pigment cells and cartilage development, and hormone regulation. Belyev's foxes proved, in real time, in a lab, that this entire package of traits can emerge from selecting for exactly one thing: tolerance of humans. Which is exactly the trait that camp trash piles were accidentally selecting for in wolves, tens of thousands of years earlier, without a single scientist involved. So if self-selection through garbage and calm temperament explains the personality and the physical quirks, what does the actual family tree look like? Because here's the detail that surprises almost everyone: dogs are not descended from the wolves you'd see in a modern forest today. Genetic studies comparing dog DNA to both ancient and modern wolf populations have shown that dogs split off from a now extinct population of Ice Age wolves, a lineage that no longer exists in its original form, sometime probably between 20 and 40,000 years ago, likely somewhere in Eurasia, though the exact location is still debated and shifts slightly with every new ancient genome researcher's sequence. Modern gray wolves are, genetically speaking, more like distant cousins of dogs than direct ancestors, both lineages descending from a shared, vanished wolf population that split apart around the same time humans were spreading trash piles across Ice Age Eurasia. And the timeline itself has been getting pushed earlier and earlier as ancient DNA techniques improve. For decades, researchers assumed dog domestication happened alongside the rise of farming, roughly 10 to 15,000 years ago, on the theory that settled agricultural villages, not mobile hunter-gatherer camps, would have generated the kind of consistent food waste needed to sustain wolves near humans. But genetic evidence, along with a handful of remarkable fossil finds, including dog-like skeletal remains in Siberia dated to over 30,000 years old, has pushed the plausible window back well before agriculture existed at all. Which means the earliest dogs weren't farm animals. They were hunter-gatherer camp followers, self-selected scavengers, living alongside humans who hadn't invented crops yet, hadn't built permanent villages yet, and definitely weren't thinking in terms of breeding programs. One especially strange wrinkle in the genetic record involves ancient dog remains found in Siberia and the Americas, which show that some of the earliest dog lineages split apart from each other and spread across the globe alongside migrating human populations remarkably early, in some cases apparently before those human populations had even reached the Americas. Ancient dog DNA pulled from remains in places like Siberia's Zhukov Island site, roughly 9,000 years old, already shows signs of specialized traits suited for pulling sleds, meaning humans were already selectively breeding dogs for a specific working purpose thousands of years before anything resembling written history existed. That's not early-stage self-selection anymore. That's a population already several steps into deliberate, purposeful shaping, which tells you the self-domestication phase, the trash pile phase, had to have happened considerably earlier still to leave enough time for that kind of specialization to develop. Here's where the story gets genuinely useful, not just interesting, because self-selection through calm temperament only explains the first stage. It explains how a wild wolf population fractured into a subgroup tolerant enough to live near humans. It does not, by itself, explain the second stage, how that tolerant scavenger eventually became an active partner, a hunting companion, a guard, a herder, an animal humans deliberately shaped for specific jobs. That second stage required something self-selection alone couldn't provide: intention. At some point, humans stopped just tolerating the calm wolves hanging around camp and started actively encouraging specific individuals, feeding them directly, keeping the calmest and most useful pups instead of letting nature quietly sort it out at the trash pile. This is the moment self-domestication hands off to actual, deliberate domestication, and it's a genuinely blurry boundary in the archaeological record, not a hard line you can point to on a specific date. It's worth pointing out how different this handoff moment is from the popular image of domestication most people carry around, the one involving a human deliberately grabbing a wolf pup from a den and raising it by hand. Researchers who've actually tried to replicate that scenario with modern wolves have found it strikingly difficult to produce a genuinely tame, safe adult animal that way, even with intensive human contact from birth. Hand-raised wolf pups tend to grow into wolves, temperamentally, regardless of how much affection they receive, because the underlying nervous system hasn't been shaped by generations of selection the way Believ's foxes were. This is strong indirect evidence that the taming process had to happen gradually, across many wolf generations, through exactly the kind of slow, cumulative selection pressure a trash pile provides, rather than through any single human's effort within a single animal's lifetime. You cannot tame a wolf by loving it hard enough. You can only breed calmer wolves, generation after generation, until eventually you're not really working with wolves anymore at all. Once that handoff happened, the pace of change accelerated dramatically, because now humans were doing the same basic selection Believ did in his lab, just spread out across thousands of years instead of a few decades, and applied not just for calm temperament anymore but for specific working traits: better scent tracking, herding instincts, guarding behavior, retrieving. This is the era that eventually produces the wild explosion of shapes and sizes we recognize today, everything from a wolf-sized mastiff bred for guarding livestock to a tiny, big-eyed companion animal bred for nothing but affection, all of it built on top of that original, accidental foundation laid by calmer wolves surviving better around a trash pile tens of thousands of years earlier. And this whole framework helps explain something that used to puzzle researchers: why dog domestication seems to have happened only once, or at most a couple of times, in one general region, rather than independently all over the world the way agriculture or pottery did. Self-domestication through scavenging requires a fairly specific set of conditions to get started: a wolf population already living close enough to consistent human camps, a food waste supply reliable enough to matter, and enough time without those wolves simply being hunted to extinction by nervous, resource-competing humans first. Those conditions likely didn't line up nearly as often as you'd assume, which is probably why genetic evidence keeps pointing back toward a single, narrow window and a single general region, rather than the kind of scattered, repeated invention you see with something like farming, which sprang up independently in half a dozen unconnected parts of the world once the right ecological conditions were in place. There's one more twist worth sitting with, because it reframes the entire relationship one final time. If the initial split between wolves and proto-dogs happened through self-selection, through the wolves essentially domesticating themselves by tolerating us, then the entire dog-human bond, arguably the deepest interspecies relationship on the planet, didn't start with humans reaching out to nature and taming it. It started with an animal deciding, generation after generation, one slightly calmer temperament at a time, that the risk of getting close to us was worth the reward. We didn't civilize the wolf. The wolf, in its own way, made a bet on us, long before we understood what was happening, and won. So the next time a dog rests its head on your leg, understand what you're actually looking at. Not a wild animal humans conquered and reshaped from scratch. A descendant of the calmest individuals in an entire Ice Age wolf population, selected first by their own nervous systems, then by us, across tens of thousands of years, for exactly one quality: the ability to tolerate, and eventually trust, something as strange and unpredictable as a human being. And there's a detail we haven't touched yet, one that's still being argued about in labs right now: whether cats went through anything like the same process, or something almost the opposite, and why one of those two animals ended up loyal enough to guard your home, while the other one, to this day, still mostly seems to be deciding if it's worth the trouble.